Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 24th Kennedy Lecture, if you can believe it. Thank you for coming, for taking a chance on the weather and being with us. I think you're going to be very happy today. We're going to do a different format this year, which I think will be very exciting and informative for all of you. And that is a interview type of presentation with one of our committee members, Tim Funk, that will be working with the author to do that. So look forward to that. The Kennedy Lectures have been a generous continuing gift of Thomas and Richard Kennedy in memory of their parents, the late Keith and Joan Kennedy. Joan and Keith were very active in parish life here at St. Peter from the time the Jesuits came. And this series is a tribute to their faith and their dedication to St. Peter.
Let's begin today with a prayer that we might see with the eyes of Christ. Grant us, O Lord, to see everything now with new eyes, to discern and test the spirits that help us read the signs of the times, to relish the things that are yours, and to communicate them to others. Give us the strength to grow in faith, even in turbulent times, and grant us the clarity of understanding that you gave St. Ignatius. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Father. I don't know how many of you do this, but you, with at least myself, I have certain authors that seem to run through my life, and mine has been Thomas Merton. It happened when I was 16 and was given a book, No Man is an Island, that meant so much to me. So you can imagine my surprise when this book appeared on my doorstep some years ago, mysteriously. And I read it probably as quick as I could have ever read a book like this, and then read it again. And as you can see from the markers, it's been pretty well examined. And I think the only other book that I have that many marks in is Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. So it occurred to me that I didn't know where it came from, and it was on my mind for quite a while. And we had just returned from the first time I'd ever been to the Abbey of Gethsemane, had gone to Bellarmine University to see Merton's depository of his literary estate. So I thought somebody knew that, and that's why I got the book. So I kept asking around, and never could find anyone that would admit to it. And finally, my wife, who is always very succinct and timely, said, "Alex, you know we have a son who owns a bookstore." You think? So thank you, Jonathan. And Blue Bicycle Books in Charleston. That sounds like a plug, it is. Paul Elie is a senior fellow in Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and a regular contributor to The New Yorker. He is the author of 2 books, The Life You Saved May Be Your Own, and Reinventing Bach, both National Book Critics Circle Award finalists, as well as dozens of essays, articles, and reviews. A 3rd book about the arts and religion in the 1980s is forthcoming. He spent 15 years as a senior editor with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. At Georgetown, he is the curator of the Faith and Culture Conversation series, hosted by the Office of the President, and the director of the American Pilgrimage Project, a university partnership with StoryCorps. Please welcome our guest, Paul Elie.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here And thank you to so many people who've helped make this possible, to Father Stevens, to Christine, to Alex, to Tim Funk, and to others. Very, very glad to be here and to be joined to you in this community just for this morning. I've learned something about the series in the past couple of days, and I heard that one of your previous guests was Father Greg Boyle from Homeboy Industries in California. And as the story was told to me, Father Boyle was told by some of the homeboys that you got to start with a joke. And so he came up with a joke, and a pretty good one. It had never occurred to me ever to start with a joke. I'm not sure I've ever told a joke in public. So I'm going to breach that expectation. But I do have a prop. And this is my traveling copy of my first book, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, which to some extent is why I'm here today. And it's pretty beat up at this point. And there's a story there that this event is really the latest episode in. And that winds into, I hope, what brings me here. It's has to do with pilgrimage. A lot of people, they'll say, I really liked your book on American pilgrimage, which was, strictly speaking, the subtitle of the book, which has the formal title, The Life You Save May Be Your Own. But the pattern of the book and to some extent, the subject of the book is pilgrimage. And I've spent time writing the book, and then since then, trying to figure out what that means. So I'm a true child of the Second Vatican Council. My granduncle was a bishop at the council. He was the Bishop of Burlington, Vermont. I was born in September 1965, named Paul. I thought it was because Pope Paul was... It was announced in the New York Times the day after I was born that he was coming to the U.S. for the first time. I just asked my mother about it a couple weeks ago, and she said, we were too busy to read the paper. Are you kidding? We had two kids, under a year old. But in any case, the council and what it meant was a matter of discussion and of real significance in my family, growing up in a real Vatican II parish in upstate New York. And our sense that the council was a great thing, that it was really pertinent to our lives, was so strong. All the more so because then my granduncle would show up and say Mass in the parish and then come to supper at our place. Well, so I spent a lot of time thinking about the Vatican Council. But of all the things that the council did, I guess the one that's had the most significance for me as a writer is the way it produced a new set of images or figures for the church. The people of God on pilgrimage in time. There's probably some of you who know the fine print of the conciliar documents. If I've gotten it a bit wrong, I apologize. But of all the different notes that are struck in the history of the church, what the church is, to call the church the people of God on pilgrimage in time was really significant. The people of God, the church is the people of God, not simply the ordained, not the physical structures of the church, not its divine appointment only, but the people of God. On pilgrimage in time, church has a long history, is very aware of time, but let's just say that in the couple of centuries prior to Vatican Council II, the timelessness of the church was often given greater emphasis. So to affirm that the church is in time, in history, partly shaped by that history as much as shaping it, bearing historical contingency, that was a statement of real significance. And how are we to understand that time? Pilgrimage. So I'm taken with this term, but when I got the contract to write this book, I didn't know what a pilgrimage was really. I suddenly was faced with the challenge of I knew somehow I wanted the book to be about pilgrimage, but I didn't have a full understanding of pilgrimage. So I looked, first of all, to the writings of the people that the book was about. Dorothy Day's column in the Catholic Worker was called On Pilgrimage for many, many years. Walker Percy contrasted the scientific view of the world and of the human person as an organism and an environment with the scriptural and Judeo-Christian idea of the human person as a pilgrim and wayfarer suspended between two infinities. Flannery O'Connor emphasized in the most dramatic way possible the narrative aspect of our lives through the remarkable compression of her short stories, in which entire lives seem to be brought to a climactic moment, a moment of grace, some people call it, in just a few pages. And Thomas Merton, his conversion to Catholicism, his entering the Abbey of Gethsemane, and then his imagining of himself outward from that abbey to different places, medieval monasteries, Native American settlements, peace marches, and so forth, was a kind of imaginative pilgrimage that then he made actual when he left the monastery several times in what turned out to be the last years of his life. So the theme of pilgrimage I kind of worked up from looking at their work. And here's what I came up with. A pilgrimage is a journey taken in the light of a story. The story precedes us. We enter the story in the middle, and we're aware that it precedes us, and figuring out what that story is and where we fit into it and what pattern it produces for our own life is part of the undertaking. Pilgrims, and this is best represented, I suppose, by Dante and Chaucer, travel in company. Dante is with Virgil until the last third of the Commedia. The Chaucerian pilgrims are a kind of merry band going forth. So pilgrimage is not typically a solitary individual experience. And yet, the pilgrim is asked to understand the experience for himself or herself, to see it firsthand with his or her own eyes. So the pilgrims travel together, but they're expected to grasp its significance individually. They're expected somehow to be changed by the experience. This is what distinguishes it from mere travel or tourism. You would go to the holy site, touch the relic, see the statuary, be in the place where something of significance had happened, with the expectation that that would actually matter for your life, and that wasn't just one more thing you were seeing or doing. And then the pilgrimage is, I don't want to say capped, that's not the right word, is carried forward by the fact that the pilgrims returning from the journey narrate their experience to others. So the act of telling the story is an act of understanding what happened, and at the same time an act whereby the pattern of pilgrimage and the desire to take part in the pilgrimage is passed on to the hearers. So that's my thumbnail sketch of what a pilgrimage is. It owes a lot to the work of these four writers, and it owes something to some other things, and that's what's really useful about this term. Pilgrimage is a term that has great resonance in the history of this country. We think of the Pilgrims, so it's not just a Catholic term, but one that is very alive in Protestant American history. It's alive in Judaism, it's alive in Islam. It's a word that has not been degraded by use and is still retains its power for people of no religion. It's a common word used, in travel magazines and self-help books, but still, in my view, has retained its force as a a journey that you take where something of significance is going to happen and you don't quite know what it is. So in all those senses, this term pilgrimage, I think, is a really useful way to understand the narrative that we belong to as American Catholics and how it overlaps with those other narratives that I've just suggested. And it turned out to me to be a useful pattern to understand the way that these writers' works fit into our lives. Because each of them kind of read their way into their own story, then lived it and wrote it so that others, and now it turns out us, are reading those accounts and reading our way into their stories with the effect of having that become part of our story. So Dorothy Day read Dickens and Tolstoy and detected something there that she later felt was a kind of religious aspect of their work and thought, I want to kind of live like that. Then she read the Gospels and realized that there were lots and lots of people in immigrant America living that way, and she wanted to join herself to them. Thomas Merton was at Columbia University, and he reads about Trappist life and medieval theology in books by Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain, and he's staggered to realize there are people still living this way in Kentucky in the United States. And he goes down there and kind of walks into the very life that he's been reading about. Walker Percy had tuberculosis. He spent a couple of years on his back, so to speak, in sanatoria in Connecticut and upstate New York, reading a lot of fiction and a lot of existentialist writing. And in a way, he recognized in the plight of the existentialists who have to decide how to live and almost decide to live his own predicament. And then he brought that narrative back into the narrative of the writing of the American South in a way that invigorated the literature of this part of the country in a new way. And Flannery O'Connor, she was such a prodigy. She was working so fast. She got to Iowa. She was writing stories about life in the South. But in my account, it wasn't until she recognized that the rural South had strong resemblances with the culture of the Bible that she realized that the overlap between the biblical narratives and the stories that she witnessed in rural Georgia enabled her to see that part of the country as belonging to the biblical story and vice versa. So these people kind of read their way into their own lives and then wrote the work that we know them for so that we were drawn into the pattern through our reading of their stories. So and some of you have read the book, so this will be familiar to you. But now I'm happy to say the book has been around over 20 years, and it's a great satisfaction for me to be able to speak to you about a book that I wrote 20 years ago, because it means that all the stuff that I just said isn't just theory. It's somehow happened. The book has a life that's continuing, and it has a narrative history, which I like to think is suggested by the fact that it's so beat up. I mean, I've been able to give a lot of talks about it and traveled speaking about it, and it's very meaningful to think that it now has a lifespan of its own, and then to think about it as joined to the life of this community. I mean, just in the past 24 hours, I've learned about the history of this community because the people I've met know the history. Founded in 1851, the old church. 1893, the second church. North Carolina as missionary territory. Not so many Catholics. Then the Benedictine role, and if I get any of this wrong, forgive me, I've just picked it up since I arrived. And then the Jesuits having a presence here in 1986 in this church. Then the changes in the way we aggregate and in parish life such that this church in the city draws from 15 different zip codes, Father Stevens told me. And here we are today. And now the church facing a renovation, and a renovation that's occasioned partly by the fact that the Catholic Church is growing in this part of the country due to migration from other parts. So that's So this initiation into the life of the Catholics of North Carolina that has come to me in narrative terms in the past 24 hours both joins that narrative to these narratives that brought me here, and to me is a kind of proof of concept about how to understand our lives as Catholics in narrative terms rather than, let's say, in catechetical terms or strictly theological terms is both natural and fruitful. I hope so, and I'm going to leave things there and fill things out in conversation with Tim Funk. I'm really looking forward to it.
So we appreciate your willingness today to answer our questions. We'd like to cover a lot of territory, so let me jump right in. Few, if any, of us here today will ever get to see Pope Francis, who you cover for The New Yorker, up close and in person. You did last year, joining other writers and artists like filmmaker Martin Scorsese. I wonder if you could share with us, in a room at the Vatican, share with us sort of your impressions that day of this man who was suddenly thrust into the brightest of limelights in 2013. I mean, anything surprised you about him?
It was the second time that I'd met Pope Francis. I met him in 2015 in St. Peter's Square. I was writing for Vanity Fair at that time, and I contrived to join a group of pilgrims from Argentina and watched him work his way down the line and spend a little time with each of us. And in that piece for Vanity Fair, I characterized him as the Pope who looks the whole world in the eye. Because what my strongest impression then is he looked me right in the eye, and he was very present there for a minute or 90 seconds. And then he did the same thing with the next person, looking that person right in the eye. I had that experience again during the audience last May. Smaller room, much smaller group. I was put in the front row for reasons I still don't understand. But I sat next to Pope Francis' friend, Rabbi Abraham Skorka, and less important was my moment with him than his way of addressing us as a small group. And the strongest impression I had was that this is like maybe the main part of the job, being present to people individually. True for all popes, but I think it's something that Pope Francis has done in a particularly intense way of being individually present for each person for that short time.
So Pope Francis has been on the job for about 11 years now. Unlike some of his predecessors, he seems more interested in listening and welcoming than wagging his finger. Will his vision for the church and his passions survive him, do you think? And would you call him a transformative pope?
Will his way of doing things survive him? It's hard to know. It's going to depend on the next pope. I wrote a piece way back in 1994, I guess, when Crossing the Threshold of Hope came out. Pope John Paul was supposed to come to America in connection with the book, but he was ill, so the trip was postponed by a year. And the piece that I wrote, which was for the New York Times, explored the surprising fact that after Vatican II, popes had actually become more important, not less so, because a lot of the thrust of the council was going to move away from a papal power. But the person of the pope means so much to so many people. So Pope Francis matters because he's here now with us, and the character of the next pope is going to matter a lot for whether it's more open or not. We don't really know. And I think that's just reflects how much we all have invested in this particular person at this moment in the life of the church.
So we're going to get back to the Pope and the Catholic Church in a bit, but there are a lot of people out there that want to hear you talk more about your books. In The Life You Say May Be Your Own, which you talked about up there, you write about Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Flannery O'Connor, and Walker Percy. None of them lived long enough to see the 21st century, but you have written that these four Catholic writers, and I'm quoting you, quote, are still very much alive. They speak to us and invite us to reply. to transpose their stories from their lives to our own. I know you dealt with it some up there, but can you say a little bit more about why so many of us still find inspiration and even spiritual enlightenment in their words and in their lives?
First of all, I think it's true. 20 years on, these figures are mean as much to as many people as they ever did. Dorothy Day's up for canonization. The others are present in different ways. The sincerity and integrity of their searches, the fact that they wrote so well about them. You know, history is written by the writers. So these people wrote so well. And then on top of that, I think 3 of them were converts, and the 4th of them grew up in a part of the country that was not characteristically Catholic. So that offers us of subsequent generations points of access that are useful. I say at the end of the book, I write at the end of the book, we are all converts now. That modernity is sufficiently deep that a real religious commitment isn't something you can just have bred in the bone. It has to be elected at some point. And so the experience of the convert, especially a convert from a worldly background, is very recognizable even to those of us who spent our whole lives in the church.
So in your book, you call Merton, Day, O'Connor, and Percy the School of the Holy Ghost. In 2024, are there other newer Catholic or even non-Catholic writers who might be candidates for that school, and would we find them to be a more diverse group?
This is the question, Tim, that has come up really in every conversation I've had since the book was published, because the greatness of those writers makes us yearn for that impulse to find further expression, I think. I don't think there's an analogous school of the Holy Ghost in our moment, for a couple of reasons. One is, and I spelled this out in a talk that I gave at Georgetown back in probably 2008, published in Commonweal. I think that the remarkable outpouring of creativity that is represented in literature, Catholic literature, by these 4 writers, and in other areas of the Church's life by the Second Vatican Council, left the next generation in the role of kind of figuring out what had happened in that moment. Matthew Arnold, the 19th century literary critic, distinguished between creative ages and critical ages. So I think the creative age that I chronicled in my book has been followed by a critical age to which I belong. A lot of evaluation, people writing histories and biographies, a lot of it takes place in nonfiction, and this is important work, and it's the work I've given myself to for a couple of decades, but it's a little bit different from that kind of imaginative work. And then I think that the religious impulse in the arts has just gone in a slightly different direction, and I'm in the new book, which I'm just about finishing, called The Last Supper, if the title holds. It's about what I call crypto-religious art and music and literature and film. Martin Scorsese, Wim Wenders, Wings of Desire, Iron Reed by William Kennedy, Czesław Miłosz, the poet, and so on. These are people whose work raises the question of what they believe in a way that raises for you the question of what you believe as you encounter it. And I've spent the last few years trying to, in effect, answer the question you just posed by writing another book.
That's a good way to do it. So the book you talked about up there, on these 4 iconic writers, it's in many ways a tribute to the power of reading and writing. But today, books are having to compete for the time and attention of would-be readers. There's iPhones, social media, podcasts, you name it. Are we too distracted, or are our attention spans too short-circuited to give books a chance to change and deepen our lives these days?
It's definitely something I worry about. I see that my sons, who are very literate, read a great deal, but very few books. And to travel on an airplane, like coming down here, on a long flight, people are watching a movie, and in a short flight, they just take a nap. I don't see many books, if you walk down the aisle the way I remember seeing 20 years ago. Maybe it's on a Kindle or something. That said, one of the most useful aspects of the knowing the history that I recounted in The Life You Saved May Be Your Own is to be reminded of how this is a kind of constant complaint. Thomas Merton, in the summer of 1939, he spent on the fire escape in the West Village writing in his journal. He wrote everything. The journal's probably 200,000 words. And he complains about, and this shows up in the Seven-Story Mountain too, of the neighborhood with its 5,000 radios, this distracted culture. I mean, World War II was taking shape in Europe. If there's any time when you should be glad people are listening to the radio, you'd think that might be it. But his monastic impulse was already so strong that he felt the keenness of society and its distractions way back in that time. So every age has its distractions, and we don't have to go into it more than, self-restraint can keep us from going too far, but it's always a problem.
Yeah, I didn't mention television streaming yet. So on the flip side, a pastor who's a big fan of your other book, Reinventing Bach, sent me this question for you. In that book, he says, you write about how traditional art has managed to survive due to technology unheard of when the art was created. Mass publishing and then audio recordings made Bach's music available to anybody, everywhere. How do you think technology has changed and is changing how we live our faith, especially in these turbulent times?
It's a good question, and I think that the pastors who have watched church attendance change since the pandemic might have their own answer to this. Telling the story of Bach's music, analogous to what I just said about Merton and the radios, it's a reminder that technology didn't happen yesterday, that this has been taking a role in our society in its current form for just about 100 years. So that helps to give us the long view. I'm thinking just how much is out there now in a positive sense. Flannery O'Connor did one video appearance, a TV show in 1955. And to see her like walking and talking, for the one time ever, it's an astounding experience. Whereas authors of any stature now, we have dozens of conversations online, and so much of the conversations like these that were kind of lost to the mists of time are now available for the curious, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. So let's get back to the Pope Francis beat, but stick with writing. This Pope has written a few books, but my sense is you don't think he's going to make his mark as a writer-pope. But you have shown an appreciation of some of his imagery. Examples, he said he sees the church as a field hospital after battle, and he wants the smell of the sheep on his priests and bishops, rather than think of themselves as shepherds and pastors, not princes of the church. Talk about his use of imagery and what it could mean for us as Catholics.
Well, it's a tribute to Pope Francis that he can characterize us all as sheep, and we think it's a good thing, right? Very few clerics, in my view, could get away with that. But that points to what I think is the real significance of this. Let's say in my lifetime we've had 3 popes. The papacy has been shaped by their particular character and disposition. Pope John Paul II, who trained as an actor, was a dramatic figure. The sense of the consequence of Christianity, the mattering of it, the struggle between culture of life and culture of death, you could feel in his person the way he worked it out before our eyes in his many trips and so forth. Benedict was a scholar. Every word in place, his interviews even are perfectly composed, not an errant word. Beautiful stuff, but essentially a scholar. And I would say that Pope Francis is essentially a conversationalist. related to what I said earlier about my experience of him at the audience. Whoever he's sitting with, he's present for that person, he hears their questions, he responds in the moment to what has been asked in the best way that he knows how. And often it produces these images like the field hospital after battle, or the shepherd needing to have the smell of the sheep, that are earthy and conversational. And to me, that's a big part of his impact, is that he doesn't seem to be drawing from a playbook. That he seems to generate those ideas relatively spontaneously, and that becomes a kind of model for how to be alive as a Christian in the world that goes right up to the Pope himself.
So Pope Francis is the first Jesuit to become Pope. So let's talk Jesuits. We're a Jesuit church here. You went to Fordham University, you work at Georgetown, and you've written that the ranks of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, is now half of what it was in 1965. You can now get an education at a Jesuit high school or a Jesuit college without actually having a Jesuit teach you. We're here at St. Peter's. We love being a Jesuit parish. As you mentioned, we've been since 1986. But with the dwindling number of Jesuits, we do worry how long it can last. Any thoughts on the Jesuits and their future?
So I was profoundly formed by Jesuit education at Fordham. I didn't know what a Jesuit was when I went there, but that place in the 80s had more Jesuits than anywhere in the world, we were told. But half of them were on the faculty, and half were there because it was New York City and they had other projects, or they were in the infirmary. But I wrote in the New Yorker that it's possible to get a Jesuit education without even meeting a Jesuit. At that time, we couldn't help but meet Jesuits, and I met several dozen, and it was one of the most powerful, formative experiences of my life. How, I think, is a matter for another question, but what does that mean when there are fewer numbers of Jesuits? I think it means that those of us who have been formed in some fashion by the encounter with Jesuits ourselves have to embody the Jesuit charism in our lives. It's not in my contract, but that's part of my role at Georgetown, is to be someone who speaks Jesuit, who's not a Jesuit, who can't help but portray how much this tradition has meant to me, and it informs my work whether I want it to or not. But my ability to articulate that and communicate it, I think, without wanting to sound presumptuous, is kind of where things are going to have to go. That those of us who have been affected by Jesuits pass that on, almost in the manner of like the pattern of pilgrimage that I set out at the beginning of the hour.
So in 25 words or less, how would you describe the Jesuit charism for people that may not go to church here?
The Italian novelist Italo Calvino said that Ignatius was the first modern man because he moved the imagery of religious life off the walls in the church and inside the walls of the head. So that's not just intellectual. Jesuit spirituality is personal, it's imaginative, it's intense, and it's mobile. It's not about architecture and not about fixed communities in some rural place.
So let's get into some of the controversial stuff here. You've chronicled the ongoing battle between Pope Francis and conservative bishops in the United States. But the Pope seems very popular with U.S. Catholics. A 2021 poll by the Pew Research Center found that 82% of them had a very or mostly favorable opinion of Pope Francis. What do you think the Pope's appeal is here in the United States, and why the disconnect between so many of the bishops and their flocks in the pews?
I think Pope Francis's appeal is owing to the fact that he's a true Christian, and people can recognize that. As for the battle with the bishops, so I've taken a lot of trouble in my writing to avoid the martial imagery, because I think it's not useful. But the headlines of the pieces often carry it. And I accept that. But
And the questioners.
yeah, exactly. And I'm not knocking you. I'm saying that my awareness of the language of journalism has led me to try to bend my work away from that, with the full understanding that the editors of the piece have a different approach, and I'm okay with that. But so I don't really think there's a battle going on between Pope Francis and the bishops, certain bishops. I think these are serious, sincere people who have significant differences of points of view over really important things. As for the larger church, and there's a real tension that you're speaking to, the paradox of American Catholicism is that, or at this moment, the church and the people who lead the church, many of them clergy, derive a lot of their importance from the fact that there's so many Catholics, 60 million American Catholics. So nobody wants to de-emphasize just how large the church is. But in point of fact, the number of Catholics who actively participate is a much smaller proportion of those 60 million, and the people who are really ardent about their faith is a much smaller proportion of them. And both the bishops and, let's say, traditionalist Catholics are drawn from that much smaller kind of subgroup of a subgroup. The most vocal Catholics and the most intense Catholics are almost by definition not representative of this very large group of people who in some way define themselves as Catholics. And that's one reason for the tension. The hierarchy wants to claim the big church because of the influence that it gives them, but the people they consider their actual flock is a much smaller church. And Pope Francis is willing to kind of accept that big church as the Catholic Church, and then you get a lot of tension.
So more than 24 Catholic dioceses in the United States have declared bankruptcy because of what's been called the Church's clergy sex abuse crisis. Others, including prosecutors and attorneys general, have had a different name for a church that has a history of cover-up and secrecy in this area. They've called the church a criminal enterprise. You have written about all this, including an act of violation on you by a priest at Fordham University. Do you think the church is confronting this crisis with honesty and resolve? And what have the years of betrayal and secrecy cost the church in terms of trust? And can they earn that trust back, do you think?
This is really the mother of all questions for American Catholics, I think. Is the church dealing with sexual abuse, clerical sexual abuse, with resolve? It's a big church, a couple of billion people all over the world. So I can't generalize at that level of breadth. In the United States, the church is dealing with the problem with resolve. Its importance has been felt, its consequences have been felt, the knowledge that it ought not and can't happen again has been felt. The resolve is there. Honesty, I'm not so sure. And I don't think, I'm not saying people are liars or trying to be dishonest, but a real honesty about clerical sexual abuse would involve saying what happened. And the reluctance of the people who run things to have what happened be part of the story approaches dishonesty, in my view. And that was, in effect, the argument of the long article I wrote for the New Yorker about this topic. The strategy of a number of dioceses was to pay people to tell their stories and then kind of put them in the hopper and bury them. And we're going to see the consequences of this when we can't tell the story of a 50-year period of American Catholicism because a lot of the unfortunately, most important things that have happened have been left out because non-disclosures and everything else have kind of kept those stories out of view. If we can't say what happened, we can't be honest. And a lot of the stories are already lost. But I took no pleasure in telling the story of my own violation in the pages of the New Yorker. And people by the Jesuit priest Edward Zogby, by the way. And people I knew said, "Paul, did you really have to do that?" Yeah, I kind of did. Because if you don't say what happened, you're not really being honest. And what happened was I told that story about Father Zogby. Then I got a call from a priest in New Jersey who said he did the same thing to me, same month. Then a couple years later, the Vatican puts out a report on Cardinal McCarrick. And there on page 40 or something of the report is a note about Zogby doing the same thing to a third person. So my telling of the story engendered other people to tell, and that's how being honest works.
So this next question may sound familiar because it was the headline over one of your stories in the New Yorker. Is the Vatican finally ready to get serious about women in the church? The Vatican is regarded by many women, particularly I think younger women, as having deep misogynistic roots. However, the recent synod convinced some that maybe the Vatican's attitude is starting to shift. How long might it be before women are given positions of authority in the church? And please don't say 150 or 200 years.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that you celebrated that headline. Now, that was constructed by the editor I work with at the New Yorker, and she just has a real gift for finding what's at the heart of a piece of writing that I've done and posing it that way. She's a vestigially Catholic woman herself, and so she's feeling this issue. Is the church really ready to get serious about women? I honestly think it so much depends on the next pope. What we've seen with Pope Francis is that things can change. But we've also seen that so much of that change has to do with somebody at the top really saying, let's do this. I think it's pretty late for us to expect that Pope Francis will do so. But here's hoping for a successor to Pope Francis who's willing to make that move and willing to just say, let's do it. It also depends on the desire of women to stay in the church, to seek ordained ministry, etc. The desire has to be there too.
So the biggest news out of the Vatican lately was Pope Francis's decision to allow priests to bless same-sex couples. Do you think at age 87 the Pope is, thinking that maybe it's time to act on some of the things these changes he's long talked about? And do you think he felt freer to do this because Benedict XVI had passed?
So I don't think it's a simple distinction between saying stuff and doing stuff. I think along the lines of what I mentioned earlier, that Pope Francis is essentially a conversationalist. That journalist posed him a direct question on the plane about gay clergy and committed relationships, and he made the now famous remark about who am I to judge. His conversational style, both without wanting to get too fancy about it, fits into what Newman called development. Things have developed in the church, let's say in the United States at least, regarding the place and regard for gay people. That has happened.
You're a cradle Catholic. I think you go to attended a parish in New York. I'm wondering about your personal Catholicism. You mentioned the St. Paul piece, which is in Notre Dame magazine. It's fantastic if you get a chance to look it up. I think it may be on our website, actually, right? What does being Catholic mean to you personally, and what keeps you coming back every Sunday or whatever? And I guess Ignatian spirituality is still part of that attraction?
Very much so, and that's kind of a three-part question. Let me see if I can keep all the parts in place. The community I identify with is the Oratorian, the Brooklyn Oratory. It's down the hill from where I live in Brooklyn. Take my bike there. Sadly, we're having our moment when the church is being sundered by scandal, clergy, and sex. And worse than that, the fact that I had to look on some really tawdry right-wing websites to find out what was going on in my own church. That was humiliating, and I felt infantilized by the experience of not knowing anything about what was going on. But on the whole, it was a very powerful place, socially progressive, liturgically traditional, gathering in the city, much like here, people from many different zip codes. And the strongest thing I felt there is that people want to be there. We all have a sense of obligation, but it's so different from the kind of stubborn perdurance of a lot of in the pews faith. We're there, everybody's glad to be there, and that's so powerful. My feeling when I'm there is just, I belong here. It sounds so simple, but every time I sit, almost in any church, I feel that today. I belong here. And I've spent, 30 years or whatever in my writing trying to figure out what that means. What does it mean to say that I belong here? How can I complicate that practically truistic statement and figure out over half a life of writing what it means to belong to this community on pilgrimage in time? So I'm trying to work that out in writing. How does Ignatius figure into it? That was the third part of the question, right?
I think so.
I had a thought there, but what do I feel? What is my faith life? What keeps me coming back? Was it something like that?
Yeah, and Ignatian spirituality, one of the main attractions of being a Catholic for you.
Ignatian spirituality is so unabstract. I tried the contemplative prayer, struggled like so many of us do, but partly because I was the very moment I was trying to become an artist, a writer, and it enjoins you to shut down the imaginative faculty. And then there's Ignatius saying, use the imagination, compose the place and put yourself in it at the foot of the cross. Wow. I'm not even sure I made it to the end of the exercises, but I've been drawing off that insight ever since. And so, especially with a lot of the institutional churches fraying, it's in flux, an ability to recognize the imaginative aspect of our participation in this community is something that's going to be really important, I think.
So many of the bishops in the United States were appointed by Pope John Paul II and Benedict XVI. But like the Pope, they're getting older. Do you think Pope Francis will have the time and the interest to do a makeover of the American Church by appointing enough new bishops and cardinals?
So he's been in office for 11 years. He's appointed not a small number of new bishops and elevated people to the episcopate and making cardinals of folks who had spent most of their lives under John Paul and Benedict. And he'll keep doing it. More striking than a need for a makeover is, to me, how small the pool of people that's being drawn from is. Ordained celibate men. And I don't mean to be tendentious. I'm thinking about what life we have in the church, what talent we have, what leadership ability we have, and how little of that is actually accessed by the structure of the church, because of the whole history of ordination. Again, not to be tendentious, but if you leave out such a large proportion of the people who might participate, you're going to get a certain kind of people who do wind up leading.
Will we ever follow our Protestant brothers and sisters and have married priests, women priests? I mean, not probably anytime soon, but I mean, is there even in the future, do you think?
I definitely think so. I guess I think it depends on the next pope or popes. In this sense, it may, you mentioned the Episcopal Church of the Anglican Communion. They have found a way to stay together with women priests and gay priests in some national churches and not in others. It's the kind of thing, again, that the strict constructionists gnash their teeth over, but they have found a way, and that may be a way forward, that some regions of the Catholic Church go in this direction and others don't. I think that, for me, the whole story of my Catholic adulthood has been unexpected things suddenly become the done thing. Wasn't the Pope always Italian, right? There were no Jesuit popes, right? Pope never traveled, right? Just stayed in Rome, and so on. So, given the pretty significant changes that have not only happened but accepted as normal relatively swiftly, it's very possible that it'll happen when it comes to the role of women and married people.
So 6 of the 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court are Roman Catholic. 5 of the 6 are conservative. The majority certainly mirrors the Catholic Church's official disapproval of abortion, not so much on the Church's social teaching, like siding with the poor. Will history call this the conservative Catholic Church, or court rather, conservative Catholic court?
So this topic was the subject of an essay that I did for The Atlantic on the book under discussion with John McGreevy's recent history of global Catholicism. McGreevy, who's the provost at the University of Notre Dame. He'd be a good guest here if you're looking for the future. Tremendously articulate person who knows everything about the history of the church globally, really. Speaks clearly, is very irenic, balancing different positions. And his history really is from the French Revolution to the present, which is to say it's the history of the church in a time in which it's played different roles in democratic societies. The democratic society of the United States and France being where the book begins. And we can see different phases in that. And we're now in a phase where we have, the importance of Catholicism to elected officials seems less so than it was half or a century or 75 years ago, where the ability to kind of get out the Catholic vote was a big thing. And we're seeing, much more prominence of religion as it figures into the life of unelected officials in the judiciary. I tried to explain why that happened and what it meant in the piece, but I think that's the real significance, that the church not trying to kind of win over the masses, but to win over a few influential folks instead.
So you may have heard we're in an election year. I don't know what the question is, except do you have any thoughts on religion and the 2024 election? It's an open question. I'll just throw it over to you.
Well, I have the good fortune at Georgetown of being a colleague of E.J. Dionne, the Washington Post columnist. And he's a great guy, and he sounds exactly like his columns, or rather his columns sound exactly like him. He's able to express the combination of knowledge and querulousness and a slight ability to kind of push at powers really beautifully. So we were sitting there at this event, and I think I said, like, well, what am I missing, EJ? What should I be writing about? He said, kind of like you just said, election coming up, Paul. Start thinking. And my real wish as a writer, finishing this book that I've put a lot of time into for several years, in time to do some real reporting beginning, let's say, in March. And what I'd like to report on is I'd like to report about traditionalist Catholicism on the ground. I think a few people, Cardinal Burke and Bishop Strickland, are kind of media stand-ins for a certain impulse in the church that hasn't been reported on to my satisfaction. I'd like to know more about what's going on the ground in that movement, particularly because I think that's the movement that Trump is going to try to make common cause with in ways that will test all sorts of norms about church and state. I don't know if anybody remembers in March, maybe it wasn't March, in 2020, right when the pandemic hit, there was a big plan afoot for Catholics in Wisconsin to welcome Trump in a very overt way, so much that the Bishop of Milwaukee had to put out a letter saying this is not an official church thing. They would really like to use the traditionalist side of the church to mobilize them, and I'd like to be out there reporting on it.
The question I get a lot as former religion reporter is, Tim, how can these Christians be for someone like Trump who, whatever you think of him, is not necessarily, I don't think of Jesus' life when I think of Trump's life. I mean, there's this sort of disconnect between, and I know you talked about the battle not being, maybe that's overdrawn, but what do you think the appeal is? I mean, do you know yet? I know you're reporting it. I mean, what's the appeal among Christians? I mean, are they just under siege, and do they feel under siege, and he's going to fight for them, or?
So, I think there's been a big misapprehension, I guess, in a lot of the journalism about evangelicals and Trump. The misapprehension is that because evangelicals are evangelicals, religion comes first, and everything flows from religion, because these are the real Bible beaters, right? I know as a Catholic, and I'm comfortable with this, I think in some ways it's part of what being Catholic means, is that I recognize that I'm shaped by all sorts of social forces, only one of which is Catholic. Growing up in upstate New York, growing up in a suburb, going to a public schooling, having a large family, having a happy family, having parents who worked for state government and believed in civil service, and on and on and on. Catholicism fits into a welter of influences. I think the same is true for American evangelicals, that the common story is like they've sold their souls for Trump. They were fairly nationalist and fairly conservative and fairly resentful of the elite and fairly wishing for their anger, much of it racially and gender tinged, to be expressed. That's part of their formation as much as evangelicalism is. So this is not some selling out of themselves, nor is it a kind of tactical deal with the devil. It's he's tapping into parts of the formation of significant parts of the country, the anger, the resentment, the wish for clarity that in a complex world, the wish for clear enemies, the wish for spontaneity, the wish to just kind of flip the bird at people who run things.
You've written about Joe Biden, who is the second Roman Catholic to live in the White House. The first one was John F. Kennedy. It was a different time, but there seemed at the time to be a lot of pride, maybe, you know. Catholic voters tended to support him. We did live in a different time, but Biden seems more, the Catholic community seems more divided on him. And talk about what kind of Catholic you think he is, not whether he's a good Catholic or bad, but what kind of, how Catholicism affects him, and why you think he's not the overwhelming favorite of Catholic voters, maybe. I mean, that may be more than...
So when you think about JFK, and I'm saying this, it just occurred to me, so I hope I get it right. I mean, Kennedy was a Catholic. Well, let's face it, a lot of his appeal was that he was young, rich, and good looking. You know, in some ways, Biden, it's as if Joe Kennedy was elected in 1960, right? So, by those things that were so much part of the Kennedy mystique are things that Biden has a very different profile. I think that it's even before social media, it's the nature of the political hurly-burly is that the loudest voices get heard the most. And that in every age, to be subtle and complicated is more difficult. I wrote when Biden was elected that his Catholicism is part of his best way to present himself to the center. The Republicans can characterize him as some sort of crazy woke figure, and all he has to do is express who he is. He's a slightly center-left Catholic who has been formed by the church, believes in it, has struggled with it, doesn't try to solve every problem for himself, understands that issues like abortion and the role of women and the role of gay people are complicated and can't be settled in a few words or in a few days. If he can bring all that stuff to the next phase of the political campaign, the Catholic accent, I think, will be very useful to him in speaking to that center, because I think you said this to me last night, typically it's the center that is decisive in presidential elections.
Yeah.
I hope he does draw on it.
Yeah. How are we doing on time? Okay. Let me ask you about the nuns, not the N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. The biggest group on the religious landscape now are nuns, people who, mostly young people, who have no religious affiliation. A lot of them are turned off by the churches because they think it's too much into politics or, too many rules. A lot of them do believe in a higher power of God, but they want to express it in their own way, which doesn't mean coming to church on Sunday. Looking ahead, how is that going to change the Catholic Church, do you think? And I sprung this on you because I'm running out of questions here. So,
Well, so the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Dorothy Day said, people love what is presented to them to love, and God is not much presented. So in our society, when God is presented often in very kind of noisy, aggressive ways, and as you say, that's been a turn-off for a lot of people. But I think it's just a kind of empirical fact that God and religion are not presented as much. There's complex reasons for that, everything from government funding to the sexual abuse crisis to the what's on TV, etc. But so when something is not presented as an option, it doesn't become an option in the same way. And then on top of that, I think that this is going to be a real challenge for the church's anthropology. Basically, the church, liberal and conservative, progressive, traditionalist, assumes that, and I'm going to use the old language here just for the effect, religion is natural to man, that we are created by a creator, but that also means that the religious impulse is not something that's like a hobby. It's deeply wound into human nature, that we are oriented towards the divine, towards truth, towards goodness. And that orientation is basic to our understanding of people. And that lacking a conviction that it's natural to us, once you remove that idea that it's natural to us, it's a whole different discussion. And that's the discussion that the church is going to have with the nuns, which is not we are spiritual, the human person is remarkable, it's just what form does that take? But there's that prior question of even, is this part of human nature at all, or is it just a thing that some people do and some people don't do? Am I gesturing in the direction you were hoping, or?
Yeah, I interviewed Anne Lamott a couple of years ago on the phone, and I said, what do you think of the fact that nuns are now the largest group on the religious landscape? And there was this long pause, and I said, nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And she goes, oh, I thought you meant nuns in the and wouldn't it be great if they were the largest growing?
we had more nuns, we'd have fewer nuns, right?
So, say something about your next book. When is it coming out? What's it about? We were all alive in the
Right.
80s.
I just spent about 2 months revising the manuscript. The publisher and my literary agent suggested I should make it a bit shorter and not make so many song references because Bob Dylan charges a lot just for every line. So I did that, and it was microsurgery to reduce a text of about 150,000 words by 10%, just taking stuff out, and then writing a new foreword, or really it's a prologue. The book is now called The Last Supper, and the subtitle is provisionally Tales of the Crypto-Religious in 80s New York. So, as I said in response to your question about where's the School of the Holy Ghost, I think that in that moment, for various reasons, there was an abundance of art that had a religious dimension. A lot of it right on the edge of religion and blasphemy, but it's there anyhow. Why in that moment? Partly because, and this is almost refers back to what you were asking about the nuns, there was still a huge number of people who had been formed by religion and had that fluency in that imagery. Someone like Martin Scorsese growing up in Little Italy, Andy Warhol worshiping in a Byzantine church in Pittsburgh, Wim Wenders raised Catholic in Germany, Prince, a Jehovah's Witness and Seventh-day Adventist at different points in his life, Kennedy, an Irish Catholic, Toni Morrison, a Catholic convert in Ohio, etc. So these, in some ways, this is like a kind of greatest generation of people who were fluent in religion, but then took it outside of institutional forms in some ways. That's one reason why it was so big in the 80s. Another is many issues of the time, then as now, involved sex. And at that time, the institutional church couldn't really speak about sex. And in some ways, just the answer was no. No to this, no to that, no to the other thing. So the artists kind of moved into the space that the church would no longer take part in, and tried to work out these questions. The question of what does it mean for Christ to be fully God and fully man? That's the question of Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ. You'd think, look in retrospect, oh, so Christ's real temptation is to marry Mary Magdalene and have a family with her? Like, that sounds pretty orthodox from the point of view of 2024, right? But it was enough to inflame people in 1988. And then the third thing is, and this is what's really particular about New York, the AIDS crisis was, the AIDS pandemic was a profound, wrenching experience in two cities densely Catholic, New York and San Francisco. The bound-upness of Catholic communities and gay communities in same neighborhoods and hospitals in that moment, and the combination of Catholics trying to serve and help and aid, and other Catholics trying to denounce and condemn, it was excruciating. I lived in New York in the 80s, and I'm trying to capture some of that too in the book. So all these things fit together into I hope, a pretty tightly woven narrative account that begins with John Paul shaking hands with Andy Warhol on St. Peter's Square in 1980, and then moves forward to Scorsese and then to Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses.
Wow. What time is it? 11 o'clock? Okay, I have one more question, and then I mean, I hate to do this, but I'm going to open it up to some people. If you have any good questions out there, is that okay?
Yeah.
So what we always like to ask, is there anything I didn't ask you that you wish I had? And what's your answer to that question?
It's funny that you ask. I mean, I was just talking about this with somebody. So I wish I were asked a question that I don't really want to answer. And I'll explain why.
That's why I didn't ask it.
Yeah. So question I'm never asked is anything about being a Catholic parent at all. I have 3 sons, raised them in New York City. I teach at a Jesuit university. They now go there. I don't want to answer it because in the age of social media, I don't want to talk about my kids on the media, and this is the media. I'm not comfortable with that. That said, to me it's remarkable that I've never once been asked in 3 decades anything about, well, it's really 2 decades of being a parent, let's say, about anything having to do with my life as a husband and father in this tradition. And the fact that it's not asked of me, I'm not sure if I project some sort of independence that makes people not occur to me that I have a family life, or is it something that speaks more to a certain lack in the church? Why don't we talk about these things? Why isn't the life experience of parents valued, and why instead are so many people who don't have parents the ones who seem to tell us so much about the way the family ought to go? So I don't really want to, answer it at a granular way, but I wish it were asked.
Join me in thanking Paul for really helping us better understand the issues before us.